Hello and welcome to Tales from the Golden Imp. I am Joe Craig, the Emperor Skald. Last time we followed the heroes through the wilds as they attempted to overtake the Goblin Horde. Through the mountains and along deer paths they went. Alas, they walked right into a goblin ambush. After dispatching the ambush, Maris went to scout ahead to see how close they were to the wagons. That's when they found the horde itself had separated from the wagons at large. Now they faced a two-pronged attack. They had to slow down the wagons, while focusing on getting the prisoners back from the goblin nest. We saw that aid was called for by Ethan Eldos to the elves of the Great Falls Forest. There we saw a discussion between Lord Vidon and his daughter Alana to set plans into motion to aid, but would they be there in time? We also saw sabotage that was done to slow down the wagons, but will it be enough? And finally, in the lore corner, we visited the ear and learned of the secrets that it keeps. We continue following the group as they head deeper into the Dragontooth Mountains. Will they be able to overtake the Goblin Horde, or will they have to dive into the Goblin Nest to get back the prisoners that the city of Malaton have lost? We will find out in this continuation of the Calmbringer cycle. Welcome to Tales from the Golden Imp. Episode 4, Into the Nest. One pass over, Jaina and the others had their first sighting of the prisoners. They could fly as a crow. They would make up lost ground in only an hour. Alas, the mountain passes were not so forgiving. They could see the Goblin Horde for the first time, many of the goblins with prisoners strapped to their back, at a forced march towards whatever destination they were heading towards. Seeing the prisoners was one thing, but getting them back was a whole different issue. The way mountain paths twisted and turned, it would be hours before they set foot where the goblins were now. They were able to determine the pace at which the Horde was traveling, and it gave them some hope. They would be able to catch the Horde in a day, but they feared they didn't have a day to wait. Though they wanted to hurry, they knew this was not a sprint, so a steady pace would be best. They would have to rest before the end of the road, and they knew it. There was only so far that one could push their body before their body would retort. This was true for them as well as the goblins. The goblins carried an extra burden, so if luck continued, they would catch them before they reached their den. But would luck hold? They had been fortunate so far. How much longer would luck be with them? Prin was a fickle god, and would turn his back on you just when you needed him to be on your side the most. One side of hope was in the birds they witnessed in the sky. Messages were flying from Malaton on dark wings. The ravens that Malaton used were seen flying this way and that to set their alarm. Would aid come in time? That depended on what the goblins were doing with the prisoners, and they knew it. Regos had given up on his pipe at this point. There would be no respite that would offer him a moment to smoke. He was breathing too hard to do anything on those rests, other than recover for the next march. He wasn't a soldier, and had no idea how the rest of them were able to keep up so well. For Meg, it was nearly as trying, though she was able to hide it a bit better. Meg was used to running. She did it to keep in shape. This was different, however. This was a forced march over land, and the altitude was killing her sides, let alone her legs. Those that were native here clearly used to the elevation more than her. She found herself questioning what she was doing here. Not exactly the same way Regos had admitted, but in her own way. She had a goal in mind, though. There was a goblin that escaped that had bruised her side. She would know their name. She would see them dead before dawn came again. For Maris and Dandros, it was something of a debt they had to the blacksmith Durin that kept them pushing forward. Though it was different for each of them, they owed the one-eyed dwarf a debt. This debt was one that Durin would never claim they had. It was something self-imposed. Durin had kept the two of them alive in very different ways. Durin had always made sure that Maris felt connected to the community in Malatin. Though Dandros claimed he was about the only family the dwarf had, the same was nearly true for him. Dandros had an estranged wife and kid he barely got to see. Things just didn't work out between the two, and that left him wishing that he was a bit better of a father each day. He set out to be the man his daughter deserved. Durin had made sure that Dandros kept his feet planted on the ground and talked him down more than once when he felt he was a waste. Failing to be a proper husband was bad enough, to be a failure as a father was something that Dandros could not handle. He and Sylvia had grown apart. It was something not unheard of, but they had a child. They could not stay together, but what of the child? When Sylvia had stated that she was heading home to Durg and taking Deidre with her, it was a blow to his heart that he barely survived. He visited when he could, and he wrote when he couldn't. He tried to be there for his little girl the best he knew how. Durin had picked him up when he was at the lowest. Now he had the chance to return the favor. He would not leave Durin to the goblins. It was only miles and miles to go before they could get him back. Part of him thought it best if the goblins did make it to their nest, so at least the miles would end. What luck would they have in open combat anyway? The numbers were dead set against them. For Jaina, it was a point of duty that kept her going. She had to prove that her loyalty to Hallis would carry her through this trial as well. Hallis was all she had these days. Well, that and her father. She had to make them both proud. Though secretly, she knew that she had made them proud a million times already. Failure at this point was just too much. She had to get Durin and the others back. It was the truest test that she had faced, and she would not rest until they were back. So quick rests and forced marches as they went. Just seeing the horde gave them a boost of energy they all desperately needed. It gave them hope. And hope was something they all needed right now. At some point during the march, the soldier took over for the hunter, leading them at pace to get the most out of them. Regos had forced them to slow down a bit, but they were all doing well for not being seasoned soldiers, in Jaina's unseasoned opinion. The sun was beginning to go down and they were still going. It had been a very long day, starting with a long night. She was facing exhaustion from lack of sleep already, and they were just getting to the dangerous part. A short rest and they were moving again. The sight of the goblins so close, but so far away, gave them that extra bit of energy. But it wouldn't last long. They had to make good use of it. They had closed to only an hour behind the horde by the time they reached Godrick's Pass. Godrick's Pass was a vast chasm, which normally a stone bridge would cover the span. But it had grown dangerous and old, and it was in the process of being rebuilt. In the interim, a wooden log bridge was used to cross the span. Rope and wood to separate the 100-foot drop. The river below would be of little help at this height. Much to the horror of our heroes, the fate of the bridge crew was confirmed with bloodshed that was seen here. Seems the goblins had started their assault right here, preventing the crew from alerting anyone on the way to Malatin. It was quick business from the looks of things, but they were lost to them nonetheless. It did aid in confirming that the goblin nest was on the Chunda side of the pass. Even Maris at this point had to sit and rest. They didn't have much time to rest, but it was something they had to do at this point. After a half hour, they were rested as much as one could without a good night's sleep. Maris was getting restless at this point anyway. They rose and set off to cross the bridge. The bridge was designed to allow for a single wagon to cross it at a time, but with the wind, it gave it all a filling. that was less than stable. Far more stable than the footbridge that the bridge crew had been using to pack stone and mortar used to put the stone bridge in place. Slowly they crossed the bridge, and it was going fine until Meg noticed something. Guys, don't put weight on the right-hand line. It's been frayed here and it looks like it wouldn't take much to snap the rest of the way. Good eyes. We must be close to their nest. The smell of goblin is getting stronger, spoke the hunter. Eyes up for archers as well. This will be a perfect spot for another ambush. As they crossed the final logs, each of them waited to hear bowstrings sing, but none came. Maris had his face close to the ground as they went now, keeping a keen eye to the tracks. He knew in his heart of hearts that they would not be on the road for very much longer. Less than a mile later, a small road dug into the side of the mountain, pointing to a cave entrance large enough for people to walk two abreast. Height-wise, it was just tall enough for a man to walk into. It was a perfect grotto for a goblin warren to be built in. Checking the ground pointed to attempts at cover tracks, but Maris was far too skilled at tracking for that trick to work on him. He could almost smell the goblins. Looking around, were only a small gnarled bush here or there at this elevation. They would have to find a place to hide their gear they could not take with them. Here is also where they would have to part ways with Jaina and her bright, shiny armor. The high polish she kept it to would be a dead giveaway if there were any torchlight underground. Light was something they had to consider as well. Maris could see heat in the dark. Once he was in complete darkness, his eyes would help him there. Dandros was used to being in the dark, in the near absolute darkness that were the mines. But they used lamps down there. Goblins were more like Maris. They could see heat in the dark, and much of their nest would be dark as pitch. Not everywhere, though. The living quarters and the working areas would be lit, as they would want to see a bit better. There would be light, but would another light give them away instantly? Jaina agreed to hold back a bit and wait for signals to advance, knowing that she would put the rest of the group at risk if she were to go with them. A scout would have to lead the way, but outside the cave was too risky for her to sit alone and just wait. Sure, she was skilled at combat, but she was not Hallis. She would take a few goblins out with her, but it would cost her her life. Reluctantly, it was decided that she would have to enter the hornet's nest as well. First, however, Regos and Maris would scout things out. Meg thought about joining them, but decided to catch a little bit more of her breath. Now that they were here, it seemed to be sinking into them just how dangerous of a situation they had put themselves in. And so it was that Maris would lead Regos into the darkness of the cave. Creeping their way into the mouth of the cave, Regos made the choice worth it, stopping Maris just before he hit a tripwire. It looked as if the mouth of the cave was littered with trip lines they could avoid if they took careful steps not to trip over one. They were spread in a manner that it would take luck to avoid all of them. With the last rays of sunlight streaking into the cave, they could make out the web of small threads. The final layer of trip lines held another interesting thing. A row of brush from the wall to wall was placed here. The trip lines all tangled up in it as well. They would have to step over the bushes, but would have to do it very carefully. And Dandros would not have the same luxury. The two sneak thieves debated with one another silently about the best way to deal with the threat. Finally, it was decided that they would have to risk cutting the trip line, but holding it and perhaps tying it off to a rock or something to prevent it from pulling on something. But what if the tension was keeping them safe? It was a risk they would have to take. Regos would cut the line while Maris held it, preventing it from releasing on down the line. They would have to let one end drop, but from the looks of it, that side was tied off to a wall and went to nothing else. With luck, this was all an alarm system, and so long as they kept pressure steady, no tingling would let the goblins know that they were there. While listening, they tied off the end that went deeper into the caves around a piton that was in the wall. With the line cut and tied off, the two held their breath for a minute, listening for sounds in the dark. Hearing nothing and seeing less, Maris and Regos began to creep over the bushes. Maris leading the way. The two stepped over the small shrubs and adjusted them, giving them more room to allow the others to come in. Regos, nearly blind with only a shine of a rock or two here or there, gave him points of reference. He had to keep his eyes on the back of the big man he was following. A sudden stop caught Regos off guard, but with enough distance to not bump the big man. Maris had caught a whiff of something. Food. Goblin food, but food nonetheless. Regos was almost useless now, aside from the aid if there were trouble. Maris whispered to him to stay put while he checked out what was ahead. Creeping about 50 foot ahead, Maris had found an alcove. His eyes showed two bodies that were about the height of a goblin, both with some kind of stew in a bowl, and a third body that was retreating deeper into the cave. The two goblin guards quickly dove into their stew and began to chat with one another. It seemed that all the trip lines had found their way to the small alcove. Alas, the temperature of what they were hooked to were the same temperature of the room, so they could not be seen. That was the trouble with seeing heat. You could not see things that were the same temperature. They were rendered invisible to you. Maris guessed bells, but that was only a guess. Goblins were nocturnal by the most part, but living underground, any time could be nighttime. They could be like dwarves, living their lives in shifts, or so that's what Maris was told. Generally, societies gravitated around the concept of normal hours. But what was normal to one nest could be completely different for the next. What to do here? With the aid of Regos, they could dispatch these two guards and make it a little safer for the others to come in. It would be a good spot for Jaina to wait while the group dug in a little deeper. But if things went poorly or they missed in the dark, alarm bells could be sounded and they would have to retreat, and retreat quickly at that. Regos was half-elf, so he could see better than average in the dark, but he needed some light to see. Could Maris take them both down on his own, without someone sounding the alarm? He would have to try, not yet trusting Regos. Jaina seemed to trust him somewhat, but he was not Jaina. Maris trusted his own skills more than he trusted someone he just met. So with that, he quietly pulled his knife and placed it next to his foot, while he took his bow and nocked an arrow. He took aim at the far goblin. That was the one he was exposing himself to. With luck, the surprise would give him enough time to deal with the second one. He wasn't worried about the first. And so, with a breath, he leaned out from cover as he drew his arrow and took aim and let the arrow fly. A split second after that, he dropped his bow and picked up his knife that he had staged. And in for the kill he went. Maris didn't give himself time to see if the arrow flew true. He would know in a moment if it did or not. Reaching the face of the near goblin, Maris slit the throat of the goblin. As blood sprayed, he held a hand over the creature's mouth while it died to ensure that there was no more sound made than necessary. Regos had made a move to the far side of the room with a dim-lit pebble in his hand to get his bearings. He finished off the first goblin before a shout could be made. "You could have told me what you were about to do, Maris. I could have helped." Maris just gave him a nod. With only the nod, Maris then spoke. "Go fetch the others, will ya? I'm going to keep my eyes trained on the tunnels ahead to see if we alerted anyone. Be swift, but make sure they don't make too much noise." Regos obliged and began his creep back to the sunless sky. It seemed to get dark so quick in these mountains. The hunter sat in the dark. The ringing silence pressed in on him. Maris held a nocked arrow trained for any side of temperature change. He could see the cold air from outside was blowing in. Maris smelled Regos on his way out, the scent of tobacco and leather strong on him. The wind blowing into the cave was a concern. He had to risk it, however. Honestly, he had no better choice. It was this moment that he realized just how tired his legs were. He had pushed them too much today, but what's done is done. It was for a purpose. The seconds passed like hours, but Maris was patient. A good hunter had to wait for his prey to make that critical mistake. So easy would it be for the hunter to become the prey with a misstep now. Getting the others to this vantage point would be a base of operations. But they didn't know how deep this network caves went. One wrong turn and it could spell trouble. Even the end of this whole rescue mission. How much longer would he have to wait? There were limits to his endurance, and he could feel the end of these reserves. Silence still greeted him, but was this a lover's embrace? Or the still touch of Necropus in wait? Was he still the hunter, or was he prey? Touching his pouch of goblin bones for reassurance, he waited. Somewhere deep within the mountains, a woman draped in furs approached an altar set aglow from a large amethyst setting atop it. She held in reverence a fine bearded axe as she approached. As she moved predatorily into the light, it could be seen that her hair was beginning to fall out as her purple eyes set upon the altar itself. The woman lowered the axe to the tabletop, serving as a sacred space as she began to pray. Lord Callisto, awaken and hear your servant's call. Life yet churns within my soul. Lord Callisto, I present to thee a tool of thine enemy. Send forth a helper to aid your servant. Send forth a soul worthy of this blade. Lowering her face and closing her eyes, the stone began to glow brighter as a cylinder of purple light streaked to the room's apex. Hundreds of eyes turned to this light, to this woman kneeling before the crude altar. All the faces working tirelessly stopped for the moment, and in the flash, that moment was gone. A faint echo in the hall of Skald, I hear and answer your call, is all that was heard. With a smile, the woman rose as another clump of hair fell from her head. Retreating from the light, she left the blade upon the altar. The hundreds of eyes began to glow purple once more as they returned to their work, their digging. The clank of steel on stone echoed throughout the hall. Maris wasn't a prayerful man, but in this moment he found himself longing for the prayers to keep Necropus at bay. The god of death would have him in due time, but let that not be today. The wind shifted, and with that the smell of tobacco and leather, twisted with a small hint of jasmine and oil. He knew he was no longer alone. The others were there. Silence was staved off for another draw of breath. The faint blue glow from Regos' stone seemed so bright just now, but he knew it was for the others' sake. The damned light would give them away, but the others needed it. Their eyes were only good in dim light, not in pure darkness. Even Maris' own eyes were only so useful in the pitch of night. How could he say anything about the need for colors and textures? He was a predator, and seeing heat showed his prey. But so many times it cost him the silk, the velvet. He could see the passion of a lover, but missed the softness of her skin. He could see the breath of the beast that he stalked, but missed so much the beauty and splinter of its pelt, a constant odd that he found himself in. Another one now in his elements was Dandros. He made his life in the darkness deep underground. He mined not just because it was a living. No, it was home for him. He found this penetrating darkness like a warm blanket. Sure, his eyes would serve him no better than Regos's, but this was home. When he was mining, he would always consider the sight that he would leave behind. This caused him grief in the mines, but couldn't leave things just broken. He had to shape the stone to let it know that the sacrifice that was made by giving of its coal, iron, or other ore was worth giving. Dandros put his ear to the stone for long heartbeats. All was silent. "We are safe to move on from here. There's no one around for now." But how much longer? Jaina was the problem here. She was far from quiet. That was not that it was her fault. It's just not how she was trained or brought up. She was no hunter. She was a soldier. And so the group would creep deeper into the cave, with Jaina trailing behind. They could not leave her alone, no matter how much they wished they could. All it would take would be one patrol to find her, and then all would be over and in vain. Deeper into the nest they went, creeping deeper into the cave, stopping periodically to check for motion, air currents, and the rest. Slowly they pushed their advantage further and further into the cave. Going another 100 feet into the cave, they were greeted with the first choice. The cave split into two paths. One that carried off towards the north and to the east, and the other went due south. There seemed to be light to the northern passage, and much more noise. Though faint, they could hear signs of life. Nothing more but life. To the south was darkness and silence. It was as if the abyss was open to them. It beckoned them, inviting them into the loving embrace. Habitation to the north, the stillness of death to the south. What road to choose? We will find out next time in the continuation of the Calmbringer cycle. Today in the Lore Corner, we sit with the Deathspeakers, also known as Speakers of the Dead. These are a cult of followers of Necropus that dedicated their lives to recording the lives and records of the dead. They are the scribes for the god of death. And it is a creed that to speak for death is to be at your core neutral in all matters of life and death. you must be incorruptible in the service of death. To be a Deathspeaker is to be one chosen to be the voice, the hand and eyes for the god Necropus. These priests perform essential services all across Calidria, but especially in Feduria, where they aid the passing of the undying from their mortal coil. These are much more than an executioner, and to call them that would be an insult, though several of the Order have served this role. The origin of the Order would predate Necropus becoming a god, and it is said that the giant was a Deathspeaker before there was a god of death to speak for the dead. The Order began as a cult of nihilists that aided those that wished to pass on to do so. They would study poisons, anatomy, and weapons to ensure that the end was swift with mercy. For no one should suffer the end of their days, for the living of days was hard enough. Death comes to one and all. It's a matter of time before death comes knocking at that door. Some of the practices that began during the cultish days hold true to this day. The tradition of a death's head mask, for instance, started when the first victim, or customer, depending on how one looks at it, requested their skull to be used in some way to further the group. On the dying bed, the Deathspeaker asked if it would be an honor or an insult for her to wear the skull for a mask. From that day, the saying, "One should never know the face of death," came to be. A skull mask is worn by all Deathspeakers to this day. It was a way for the cult to stay anonymous and perform their duties without repercussions or judgments. Over time, the cult spread like a religion, and with it came the dogma and the politics of each and every religion. This is where Necropus came in. Necropus was a giant from the frozen wastes of Credo, north of the glacial wall. His family were ice merchants that would drag massive blocks of ice from the wastes to human settlements where they would sell them. Necropus had seen death and how it would twist you. When the massive man entered a circle of these would-be Deathspeakers, he found problems with the words versus their actions. Many of them took pleasure in the killing. Death was not something to take joy in. It was the end of something special and unique. This was not plucking a tomato from a vine. This was harvesting something divine, something perfect. Necropus stayed and listened to the teachings. He would ask questions, and he found that many of the things had become separate from the original meaning of the Order. When he learned that the first Deathspeakers were elves of Feduria, he set off to find the origin and true meanings. Necropus at this time had fashioned his mask from a skull of a mammoth. This mammoth was the beast of burden that meant the most to him. He had raised it from calf and wept the day of its passing. That mammoth, Nelly, had given Necropus the first taste of being a Deathspeaker, so he keeps Nelly with him always. Mammoth Death's head mask in hand, he found his way to Feduria and to the Hall of Bones. It seemed that anyone that was seeking the Hall of Bones were mourned and allowed to proceed regardless of race. There at the Hall of Bones, he asked his questions, and it wasn't long before one of the teachers knew that there was a connection between this giant and the sanctity of death. One morning, as fog lay dense over the temple grounds, this teacher approached Necropus. "Tall One, there is a being that I have consulted with that I feel you would do well to seek out. This journey is not an easy one, and finding the worm is not simple. The name of this beast is Waldrum, one of the great worms. I can help you in the seeking, but you must enter his realm and be deemed worthy. I call it a short death, but I tell you it will feel like ages. If you wish to seek him, meet me back here in 3 months' time. In that time, I will prepare the rite." The two agreed, and in 3 months' time, Necropus' mind was set. He had purified his body and mind for the journey that lay before him. There were complications to the process, however. Necropus was a giant, so the toxins used on others would not work on this big man. Desperate times called for extreme action. It was a flower from the great serpent forest in Devolton. This flower had many names over the years, but currently it is known as the Kiss from Bliss. This odd elf believed that it would be enough to induce the small death for the giant. He was wrong, however. The poison killed the giant. In his death, Necropus called out to Waldrum and found him eventually. But it was Waldrum that the nature of death was discussed, as well as the philosophy that would become the tenets of the Deathspeakers. Necropus would be able to find his way back to his body, but life did not return to it, but something else. Undeath or an unnatural life returned to the corpse. In the following months, Necropus became the teacher, and his teacher the student. 3 months passed, and the role of Deathspeaker was formed. The practices, the dress, and the code of ethics defined. It was through this that Necropus was first acknowledged as a god and patron of the Deathspeakers. Recording the teachings became known as the Book of Dead Ways. The Deathspeakers were to speak for the dead, as well as the god of death. Waldrum issued importance on the stories each person, and it was a duty of the Deathspeakers to speak the story of the dead. It was more than a simple eulogy. It was to be a record of their life. This is when the Hall of Remembrance was formed. For a duty of Necropus as the god of death was to pen the stories of each of the dead. The roles of Deathspeakers remained the same at the core. It simply evolved to include the stories of the dead and impressed more soundly the importance of anonymity with the group, as some would never forgive those that took the life, even if that life was willingly given. Respect for the Deathspeakers grew as a result of the eulogies that they were now giving. They were giving a lasting life to each and every one of the dead. Controversies did rise from this new way of doing things, especially in Feduria, as the Deathspeakers were giving the eulogy of even slaves, prisoners, and the unclean just as much as royalty, nobility, and the long-lived. As death comes to all, there must be someone to speak for the dead, to aid in the passing of the soul. The records that Necropus kept was more than just a record. It was also to decide where the soul would reside, as well as determined what souls would become gods. It is suspected that Cryptus was once a Deathspeaker, or at the very least, one who listened and paid homage to the stories that the dead would have. Other known and suspected Deathspeakers were Linsid. It is confirmed that Linsid was a trained Deathspeaker, as her father was long before that she was an assassin. And it is also said that the Butcher of Feduria is a Deathspeaker as well, but the kind that took pleasure in the killing and would only speak for the dead, he saw as deserving of the speaking. This led him to being rejected from the Deathspeakers and exiled from them. As far as dress and appearance, the Deathspeakers should remain anonymous and wear a mask at all times, in which they are at service of the dead. Typically, they would wear dark green robes or brown ones. It is unknown outside the order if this is a preference or has something to do with the ranks in the order. The typical mask is a skull mask or Death's Head mask. The Death's Head mask is a mask made from the skull of someone once living. Necropus is depicted with a mammoth skull for a death's head mask. Many in the order wear a mask from someone they loved or respected in life. Their creeds, for they are many. We speak for the dead can no longer speak. We speak for the God of death for all to hear. We remain unknown, for no one should know death. Death should always be as painless as possible, unless the dying wish for something more. Take not pleasure nor joy in the art. Life is ending, it should be mourned. To speak for death is to be at your core neutral in the matters of life and death. You must be incorruptible in the service of death. Those that betray these oaths have forfeited their lives, but not the record of life. Someone should speak for the dead always, regardless of station. Every life has a story to be told. We are the speakers for the dead. We tell the stories. Speak the stories true, for Necropus keeps them always. Paint the story of the dead true, for good or for ill. Weep for war, for many stories are lost during them. Weep for the lost, and let their stories be found. This is but a selection of the creeds. Many speak of the ways in which death should be administered, and the process for gathering stories. The Book of Dead Ways is something of a law and creeds for the Deathspeakers. A tradition that began from the recording of Necropus' teachings from Waldron. The first copy of the Book of the Dead Ways was recorded in that 3-month period. Each initiate must pen their own copy of the Book of Dead Ways, and it must be approved for accuracy before they can call themselves a Deathspeaker. Well, travelers, thank you once again for continuing the journey with me. In this episode, our group continued to track the Goblin Horde all the way back to their nest. After crossing the wooden bridge at Godrick's Pass, they found a road that went into that nest. So into the den they went. Regos and Maris first, followed by the others. And in the lower corner we spoke of the Deathspeakers, also known as Speakers of the Dead. They gave us a bit more insight into the history of Necropus, the god of death. With the decisions that they have before them, where will the road take our would-be rescuers? What will they find at the heart of this den, not knowing about what the goblins had set free? We will only find out in the next episode of the Calmbriga Cycle. Thank you for listening. And if you wish to support the podcast, rating it where you find the podcast would mean a lot. A simple thumbs up in the YouTube space, or a comment if you want to be involved in the conversation. If you want to support a bit more and get the recipes of Calidria for your kitchen, as well as lore content, please support me over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/goldenimpn. Signing up will give you access to our Discord server. I hope to build a great community over there. But I can only do that with you. So won't you join us and join the conversation? If you wish to follow me outside the podcast space, you can find me on Blue Sky at Impish Skald. With that said, I am Joe Craig, the Impish Skald. Thank you for listening, and remember, you've been scalded.